Apollo 1 fire. On January 27th, 1967, at 6:31 in the evening, an electrical spark from a bundle of wiring beneath the seat of Gus Grissom ignited inside the Apollo 1 command module on Pad 34 at Cape Kennedy, Florida. The capsule was not fueled, not pressurized for launch, and sitting on the ground. It was a routine pre-flight rehearsal test, the kind of procedure meant to be so ordinary that its only purpose was to confirm that the ordinary things worked. What the engineers outside the sealed hatch did not know was that the cabin had been filled with pure oxygen at slightly above atmospheric pressure, as was standard practice for that era of American spaceflight, and that inside that pressurized oxygen environment, the capsule's interior was lined with so much nylon netting, Velcro foam padding, and plastic plumbing that the combustion engineer's term for it years later would be a fire waiting to happen. The fire spread in seconds. Grissom, America's second man in space and one of the most experienced test pilots in the program, pulled on the hatch mechanism. White, the first American to walk in space, reached past his own shoulder to begin working the interior release. The hatch required a minimum of 90 seconds to open under ideal conditions, using a ratchet tool working in the right sequence. They had perhaps 15 seconds before the smoke became lethal. Chaffee Hume, the rookie, stayed at his station and called out to the ground, "We've got a fire in the cockpit." Those were the last words anyone heard. The command module ruptured from the internal pressure buildup, venting smoke and flame outward. Technicians outside the hatch hands burned tried to reach the men. It took 5.5 minutes to get the hatch open. By then, all 3 astronauts were dead killed by asphyxiation. In smoke so thick the pathologists couldn't determine the exact sequence of events. The investigation that followed was the first time NASA publicly confronted the gap between the pressure to beat the Soviets and the engineering reality of the machine being built to do it. More than 1,300 design changes were made to the Apollo spacecraft before it flew again. The most immediate was the replacement of the inward opening hatch, which required the cabin to be depressurized before it could be opened, and which the men had been unable to use, with a new quick-release design that could be opened from the inside in under 10 seconds. The pure oxygen atmosphere at launch pad pressure was replaced with a nitrogen-oxygen mix. The interior materials were redesigned to be fire-resistant. Apollo 7. The first crewed flight after the disaster flew without incident 8 months later. Less than 2 years after the fire on Pad 34, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. Vladimir Komarov, Soyuz 1. On April 23, 1967, 3 months after the Apollo fire, Soviet cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov launched aboard Soyuz 1, fully aware of what he was getting into. Engineers inside the Soviet space program had documented more than 200 technical deficiencies in the Soyuz spacecraft before the mission was authorized, including a known problem with the parachute canister deployment system. Komarov's friend and fellow cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin had lobbied directly to delay the flight and had insisted on being named Komarov's backup, partly in the hope that the presence of the Soviet Union's most famous hero in the launch queue would force a postponement. It did not. The political calendar tied to the anniversary of Lenin's birth and the May Day parade was treated as an immovable constraint. Komarov launched. The solar panels failed almost immediately after reaching orbit, cutting power generation in half. The attitude control system became unreliable, leaving the spacecraft tumbling through space. Over 18 increasingly desperate orbits, mission control worked through options that narrowed with each pass. Komarov fought to stabilize the craft, manually burning through reserve fuel. When the decision was made to abort and bring him home early, the re-entry itself worked. The heat shield performed, the drogue parachute deployed, then the main chute tangled inside its canister, exactly as engineers had warned it might, providing no meaningful drag. The reserve chute wrapped itself into the same tangle. Soyuz 1 struck the ground near Orenburg at over 250 miles per hour. Soviet listening posts recorded Komarov's voice in the final descent. What he said in those last seconds has been described by those who heard the recordings, but the recordings themselves have never been officially released. His remains had to be identified by a single heel bone. He was given a state funeral. his ashes placed in the Kremlin wall. Soyuz flights were suspended for 18 months while the spacecraft was fundamentally redesigned. Soyuz 11 crew. On June 30th, 1971, recovery helicopters touched down near a Soyuz capsule that had just landed precisely on schedule in Kazakhstan after a 24-day mission, the longest spaceflight in history to that point. The three cosmonauts inside Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev had spent 3 weeks aboard Salyut 1, the world's first space station, setting records and proving that human beings could live and work in orbit for extended periods. Everything had gone exactly right. When the recovery crew opened the hatch, they found all three men still strapped into their seats, motionless, their faces tinged blue. There were no signs of impact trauma or fire. The instruments showed a textbook landing. The men appeared from the outside to simply be asleep. They were dead. A pressure equalization valve designed to open shortly before landing to gradually bring cabin pressure into equilibrium with the outside atmosphere had been jarred open prematurely during the explosive separation of the service module, still at an altitude above the Kármán line, where the atmosphere is effectively a vacuum. The cabin depressurized in roughly 112 seconds. The crew had no pressure suits because suits had been removed to make room for the third crew member inside the cramped capsule, a decision approved at the program level. Dobrovolsky was found with a hand near the valve, suggesting he may have identified the problem, and tried to close it manually. Medical assessment indicated all three lost consciousness within 15 to 20 seconds. After the Soyuz 11 disaster, no cosmonaut has ever flown without a pressure suit. The three men are still the only human beings to have died beyond the Kármán line in the vacuum of space itself. The decision to remove pressure suits had been made at a program management level months before the flight because the Soyuz capsule did not have room for a fully suited three-person crew. A committee had formally evaluated and accepted that risk. The men themselves had been told about the decision and had accepted the trade-off. Everyone in the chain of command knew, and no one stopped it. The suits were put back after the disaster and have remained mandatory ever since. Ikaru 15, Flight 3-65-97. On November the 15th, 1967, Major Michael Adams climbed into the cockpit of X-15 No. 3 for his seventh flight in the experimental rocket plane, which routinely flew high enough to qualify its pilots for astronaut status under United States Air Force criteria. His mission required him to reach 250,000 feet while testing a new ultraviolet photography experiment, a routine profile by X-15 standards. At 45,000 feet, released from the B-52 carrier aircraft over the Mojave Desert, Adams fired the XLR-99 engine and began his climb. The rocket burned normally. He reached 266,000 feet, officially entering space and qualifying for his astronaut wings. Then at peak altitude, the X-15's adaptive flight control system malfunctioned, initiating an inadvertent yaw rotation that Adams didn't immediately detect because, at that altitude, the air is so thin, it provides virtually no aerodynamic feedback through the aircraft's controls. By the time the X-15 began its descent back into the atmosphere, the yaw had developed into a spin. Adams attempted corrections using conventional aerodynamic controls, which were still largely ineffective in the near vacuum above 200,000 feet. As the aircraft dropped into thicker air at hypersonic speed, the aerodynamic forces began to build on an aircraft now essentially flying sideways. At approximately 60,000 feet, traveling at Mach 5 and subjected to forces exceeding 15 G, the X-15 broke apart. Adams was still in his seat when the wreckage impacted the desert near Johannesburg, California. He was posthumously awarded astronaut wings, the first person in American history to earn them by dying during a spaceflight. The recognition came 37 years after his death, awarded in 2004 by the Air Force, long after most of the public had forgotten the X-15 program existed. Adams's name appears on the Space Mirror Memorial at Kennedy Space Center, added in 1991, alongside the names of astronauts who died in accidents many times more widely remembered. Space Shuttle Challenger. On January 28, 1986, the morning temperature at Kennedy Space Center had dropped to 29 degrees Fahrenheit. Overnight, the coldest conditions any shuttle had ever faced on a launch day. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the contractor responsible for the solid rocket boosters, had spent the night before the launch arguing with their own management against proceeding. The concern was specific rubber O-ring seals in the joints of the solid rocket boosters lost their ability to seat properly at low temperatures, a phenomenon that had been observed in previous launches but never formally flagged as a constraint on acceptable launch conditions. The engineers lost the argument. NASA's launch managers, under pressure from a mission that had already been delayed repeatedly, decided the risk was acceptable. At 11:38 in the morning, Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off carrying 7 crew members, including Krista McAuliffe, a New Hampshire school teacher who had been selected through a nationwide program to become the first civilian in space. Thousands of schoolchildren across America were watching the launch live in their classrooms. 73 seconds after liftoff, a plume of flame that had been leaking from a compromised joint in the right solid rocket booster breached the external fuel tank. The tank ruptured. The orbiter was torn apart by aerodynamic forces at an altitude of 46,000 feet, not in a traditional explosion, but in a structural breakup that sent the crew compartment arcing upward on a separate ballistic trajectory before beginning a 2-minute, 45-second fall toward the Atlantic Ocean. 3 of the crew's personal emergency air packs were found to have been manually activated, indicating that at least some members of the crew were alive and conscious after the breakup. The capsule hit the water at 207 miles per hour. All 7 were killed. The Rogers Commission investigation that followed found not just an engineering failure, but a management failure. Concerns about the O-rings had been raised and documented inside NASA and Morton Thiokol for years before the disaster, and the organizational culture had evolved to treat an unresolved safety risk as an acceptable flight condition rather than a barrier to flight. Space Shuttle Columbia. On February 1st, 2003, Space Shuttle Columbia was 16 minutes from landing at Kennedy Space Center after a 16-day scientific mission when the left wing failed. During launch on January 16th, a piece of foam insulation roughly the size of a briefcase had broken off the external tank's bipod ramp and struck the leading edge of the left wing at over 500 miles per hour, punching a hole in the reinforced carbon-carbon panels that protect the wing during re-entry. NASA engineers had seen the foam strike on launch camera footage and formally requested that military satellites or reconnaissance assets be used to photograph the wing damage for assessment. The request was denied by program managers who reasoned that even if damage was confirmed, nothing could be done to repair it. The 7 crew members spent 16 days in orbit conducting experiments, unaware that their vehicle had been fatally compromised. When Columbia began re-entry over the Pacific Ocean, superheated plasma at temperatures exceeding 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit began flowing through the breach in the wing's leading edge. Sensors throughout the left side of the orbiter began sending abnormal readings to mission control. At 8:59 in the morning, over Texas at an altitude of 207,000 feet, the left wing separated entirely. The crew compartment was destroyed as the shuttle broke apart, scattering debris across Texas and Louisiana. All 7 crew members died. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board's report was a direct and deliberate echo of the Challenger Commission's findings. An organizational culture inside NASA that had normalized risk-suppressed dissent and treated the absence of a previous catastrophe as evidence that the risk was manageable. The board's report explicitly noted that NASA had not learned the organizational lessons of Challenger despite 17 years and multiple formal reviews between the 2 disasters. A voice recorder recovered from the crew compartment debris later confirmed that the crew was fully engaged in their normal re-entry procedures up until the moment the breakup became unsurvivable. There was no warning the crew could have acted on, and no action available to them if there had been. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments below.